Hey guys, Robo here. This is a video on suggested changes to Mages that I would recommend for patch 11.0, which is the upcoming expansion in 2024. The reason I'm doing this in video format is that I previously posted large forum threads explaining my thought process in written format, which resulted in large volume of text that made it difficult for people to want to read and for me to convey my ideas. I want to start off by saying that I liked a lot of the changes that patch 10.1.5 brought to the Mage class, especially for Fire and Frost, and the removal of Rune of Power. As we'll see, however, I think Arcane was left behind relative to the other specs, receiving only changes for the first week of the 11.1.5's PTR cycle and no further iterations thereafter, unlike Frost and Fire, who got several weeks of changes. Starting off with some talents in the general class tree, there are really only 5 talents I'd like to target individually for some changes, namely due to either some quirks that can be ironed out, or because these talents lack a purpose and are thus difficult to argue in favor of keeping. Starting off with Ice Flows, this is a phenomenal talent that suffers from a unique problem. Because this talent only allows us to cast while moving for a single spell, you can end up in a situation where double Lust is active for Arcane, or Lust plus Icy Veins is active for Frost Mage, where the value of this talent diminishes severely due to the fact that the single spell cast goes from its baseline, let's say 2.5 seconds for Arcane Surge, to nearly half of that in instances of high haste. I think an appropriate replacement would be to instead allow us to cast for a fixed duration of time, simply so that the talent doesn't have a negative interaction with haste, which mages tend to often face given that the Temporal Warp talent gives us 2 stacking lusts, which increases our haste by a minimum of 69% when combined. Next up, I want to talk about Rigid Ice and Improved Frost Nova. These talents both suffer from an inherent problem where if you freeze a mob with Frost Nova, not only can your damage break the enemy out of the ice, but so can your allies' damage. Furthermore, the amount of damage required to break a target out of the ice is actually quite low in my experience, rarely surpassing a single Arcane Blast. What this means is that Frost Nova will almost never last its full duration, meaning that improved Frost Nova has almost no value, and similarly, Rigid Ice, which increases the amount of damage the ice can take before breaking, also has little value because your group usually does so much damage as a cohort that an 80% ice health buff is nowhere near enough to keep the targets rooted. As such, I propose removing these talents and replacing them with 2 talents that are aimed at covering some of Mage's weak points. Currently, and especially in Season 2 of Dragonflight and Mythic Plus, Mages are strong at dealing with magic damage, but weak to physical damage, sporting around 11% physical damage reduction from their current max level armor, as opposed to Warriors and Moonkins, who sport around 35 to 40% damage reduction. In fact, it was common on certain bosses like Neuraxis to have the Augmentation Evoker place their blistering skills on the mage given how weak mages were to the rock throwers on the side. My first suggested talent addition is Focus Insight, which would aim to reduce the physical damage taken by 3 to 6% as a 2-point node. This would be a situational pick for whatever boss or dungeon currently present, given certain bosses like Sledgefist had mostly physical damage, while other bosses do a mix of physical and magic damage. My second proposed talent is aimed at helping tanks who play with Arcane Mages. Due to Arcane's high burst windows, especially when Double Lust is active, it is common to see Arcane Mages pulling aggro, sometimes even through mirror images. One example of where this was seen was on the first pull of Neltharion's Lair, which is a large 15+ mob pull during which Lust would get used, with 1 large priority target. And it wasn't uncommon to see Arcane Mages bursting upwards of 1.5 to 1.9 million DPS in Season 2, and sometimes ripping aggro on some of the mobs, especially the worms that would teleport behind you due to their aggro reset. This new talent, Mirrored Delusions, which would replace Rigid Ice, would allow for mirror images to not only distribute aggro, but would also be able to give said aggro to the tank, similar to Tricks of the Trade or Misdirect, allowing mages, and especially Arcane Mages, to not have to use Greater Invis simply for aggro reset in a number of pulls and dungeons, since the tank would gain a huge burst of threat from this talent. Next up, we have Mass Polymorph. This talent is currently scarcely seen in PvE, namely due to the fact that it requires you to be in melee range of your polymorph targets while casting it, and also because of its 1-minute cooldown. I think Polymorph is a very strong spell that has a lot of uses in Mythic Plus, and an easy way to make mass polymorph more attractive is simply to have its effect be applied to regular polymorph. If that still isn't enough to make mass polymorph attractive, you could also allow it to make polymorph usable on targets other than beasts and humanoids, giving it a wide array of uses in Mythic Plus. Lastly, I want to talk about shifting power. First off, I want to say that shifting power is a very interesting talent that works very well for Fire and Frost, and while it does have uses for Arcane, it presents an annoying problem. The current problem with shifting power in Arcane is that it turns our cooldowns from 90-second windows to 78-second windows. For Fire, this is not as impactful because of the Kindling talent and Sun King's Blessing, which already reduce combustion's cooldown significantly. For Frost, shifting power turns their 2 minutes into 96-second cooldowns, which is roughly equivalent to 90-second cooldown windows. The reason for why this is a problem for Arcane is that almost no trinket or external in the game lines up with 78-second cooldowns, resulting in awkward trinket timings, such as having to use 2-minute trinkets on every 3 Arcane surges instead of 2. Similarly, this makes Arcane a difficult target to receive externals like PI or Blessing of Summer for the same reason. The cooldowns don't line up. To address this, I propose changing 2 things about shifting power. Firstly, I would change the cooldown reduction from 12 seconds to 15 seconds, and second, I would allow shifting power's cooldown reduction to affect itself, which it currently does not. This would effectively change shifting power from a 60-second cooldown to a 45-second cooldown, while also providing 3 extra seconds of cooldown reduction. Concurrent to this, I would also change the cooldown of Touch of the Mage and Arcane Surge from 45 and 90 seconds to 1 and 2 minutes respectively. With the above change to shifting power, this would change our cooldown windows from 78 seconds to 90 seconds, which lines up a lot better with trinkets and externals than the current setup. With the above changes, given that the downtime of Arcane windows would increase by roughly 15%, I would also buff Touch of the Mage and Arcane Surge by roughly 15% each to compensate. I have some rough numbers here that you can use, but tuning would ultimately decide what this changes to. For Frost, the windows would remain roughly the same, cooldowns every 90 seconds instead of every 96 seconds. Fire, however, would probably need some tuning with this change, given that this would risk increasing the frequency of the combustion windows even further. That's it for my Mage class talent tree changes. Now let's move on to Arcane changes. Here is the compounded list of the suggested talents being discussed. The first and most important thing I would change about Arcane is to place the 4 utility talents that we still have in our spec tree into the sub 8-point category as mandatory choice nodes, while also removing Crackling Energy and improved Arcane Missiles. This aims to provide the opportunity for Arcane Mages to select these talents, which is currently not recommended given that they compete with DPS talents and are thus not optimal for selection. With the removal of Crackling Energy and improved Arcane Missiles, which are currently mandatory picks given that they provide 20% additional damage to our core abilities, we can easily select these utility talents without feeling like we've lost a significant portion of our damage. This would leave Arcane's current total point dump in the sub 8 talent point category at 9 from 10 points previously. This is similar to Ret Paladins, which have the same mandatory utility choice node with Light Celerity and Guided Prayer. With the relocation of these 4 talents, 4 new talents would need to be created in the 8 to 20 point category to fill their gaps. For this, I propose the following set of talents. Starting off with Booming Surge, this talent provides 15% additional haste during our Arcane Surge windows, since this is when we can use haste without the fear of running out of mana. This talent is intended to replace Improved Prismatic Barrier, and would be placed where Mana Adept is currently located. Mana Adept would then get moved down to where Improved Prismatic Barrier currently is. I opted to place it at Mana Adept's current position since almost all builds would prioritize this talent. As such, we would want this talent to be accessible. Also, it makes the tree symmetrical with Arcancleave on the other side, which looks nice. The next talent I would propose is Arcane Battery, which allows Arcane Orb to grant 4 Arcane charges when casted, up from 1. Note that this does not affect Orb Barrage. The reason for this change is to allow Arcane Orb to have more frequent uses in single target, where although it does help after you throw out an Arcane Barrage by regenerating 2 of your 4 Arcane charges, you're still stuck either casting Arcane Blast or Arcane Explosion trying to get the remaining 2 Arcane charges. With this change and using the Charged Orb talent in single target, you could reasonably use a rotation of Barrage Orb every 40 seconds or so without significant loss to DPS, which provides more mobility to Arcane given that these are all instant cast spells, and incentivizing Arcane barrage dumping more liberally without fear of DPS loss from having to rebuild Arcane charges. I would place this talent where Foresight currently is, given that it is placed after Charged Orb, a talent that would synergize very well with this new talent. The next talent I propose is Funnel Barrage, which increases Arcane Barrage's ability to funnel into a priority target while decreasing the cleave damage. This increases the damage of Arcane Barrage by 25% while decreasing the amount of damage that is cleaved to 20% per target, down from 40%. At 5 targets, this leads to a 13.4% decreased overall damage for Arcane Barrage, but a 25% increased overall damage to the priority target, which really doubles down on Arcane's strength of priority/funnel damage when using Arcane Barrage. I would place this talent where Chrono Shift is currently located below Arcane Cleave, since Arcane Cleave is what allows Arcane Barrage to cleave to other targets in the first place. The last of these 4 new talents is Incandescence, which aims to support Arcane Missiles during the Arcane Surge windows by decreasing the channel time of clear casting Arcane Missiles from 2 seconds down to 1.5 seconds. This increases the overall DPS of Arcane Missiles and incentivizes maintaining the full channel over the current Interrupt playstyle where you want to cut your Arcane Missiles short to cast Arcane Blasts that are empowered by Nether Precision. I would place this where Supernova currently is, since the talent below it support Arcane Missiles as well. Next up, we have our cooldown increases to Arcane Surge and Touch of the Mage, which was previously discussed with Shifting Power, so I won't labor on them here. The next change is aimed at Mana Gem. My frustration with this talent is twofold. It is a damage cooldown that takes up a bag space, which is a problem for many, and it is a hassle and easy to forget to respawn the gem mid-boss fight. I've spoken to many Arcane Mages over the past few months, and they all universally agree that this cooldown should be just a cooldown, and not an item that takes up a bag space and requires you to recast it mid-fight. Also note that this talent's cooldown should be increased from 90 seconds to 2 minutes to match Arcane Surge. For my next suggested change, I would like to target Siphon Storm, which has been somewhat controversial due to how it nullifies Evocation's original intended purpose, which was to give you back mana. Because of how Siphon Storm makes Evocation give a damage buff of 14% for 30 seconds, it has transformed Evocation into another cooldown that you stack to empower your Arcane Surge windows. Furthermore, the tuning on Siphon Storm is currently so high that I don't believe you can see a scenario where this talent isn't a mandatory pick, with a DPS loss exceeding 10% if not selected due to its cooldown stacking effect, as shown on the Sims here. My suggested change is to remove the damage increasing component of Siphon Storm and instead make it remove Evocation's cooldown entirely. This would allow Arcane Mages to be more liberal with their mana use, but more importantly, it would allow Arcane Mages to invest heavily into haste without fear of running out of mana, which is another problem that is unique to Arcane. For those who aren't aware, once you run out of mana as an Arcane Mage, you are no longer able to cast your core rotational abilities, which severely impacts your DPS in a way that is completely unique to Arcane. In fact, according to the Sims shown below, there are currently only 4 negative outliers in haste stat usage, being Arcane Mage, Windwalker Monk, Outlaw Rogue, and Sub Rogue. Note that these Sims were run using 10,000 primary stat, 0 crit, 0 verse, 0 mastery, and a variable amount of haste per indicated decile, just so that we can normalize their trend. Note that the absolute values here don't actually matter, only the trend, since non-intellect classes typically have less than 10,000 primary stat gain from gear, while intellect classes typically have more than that. This trend in DPS haste decile is shown in the table and graph below. From this data, we see pretty evidently the bottom 4 outliers I was talking about down here, with Arcane being one of these 4. Now, I don't play Windwalker, Outlaw, or Sub, so I won't comment as to why these specs don't seem to do well with haste, but for Arcane, the reason is simply because we run out of mana with more haste. While I appreciate that mana management is part of Arcane's playstyle, that argument lends to Arcane being limited to only minimal amounts of haste, as having more haste is not only less valuable than other stats, but it actively prevents you from performing your normal rotation, which I think is antagonistic to having a fun playstyle. With this suggested change to Siphon Storm, we would be able to perform our rotation freely with more haste, and simply make up for it with more evocations in between our Arcane Surge windows, which I think makes evocation a much more active part of our toolkit, rather than the current damage amp stacking tool that it is. I also want to talk about a fun finding you can see on this chart here, which is actually the DPS curve for Fire Mage. It turns out that at a haste decile above 80% base haste, fire mages start to lose DPS when they put more points into haste, since at those level of haste, fire mages actually start to run out of mana. I mention it here because it's ironically a very similar problem to arcane mages, although unintended. Going back to my original suggestion, I think that changing Siphon Storm to instead remove the cooldown of Evocation would allow Arcane to have the ability to run high haste if that talent is selected, with different stat priorities if the talent is not selected, while also removing the mandatory nature of the current Siphon Storm talent. My next suggested change is for concentration. What I would change here is the wording and the way it interacts with clear casting. Currently, this talent consumes itself to act like a pseudo clear casting charge, but unfortunately doesn't interact with other mechanics like a normal clear casting charge would. My suggestion is to allow this talent to give back a clear casting charge after one is consumed, rather than itself behaving like a clear casting charge, which would fix this problem permanently. The reason for this change is that throughout Season 1 and 2 of Dragonflight, concentration did not apply Nether Precision like it should have with a normal clear casting proc, and in Season 3, it is currently not proccing the tier set at all. As of patch 10.2, the Nether Precision bug has been fixed, but the Season 3 tier set has not, leaving it in an awkward spot where it is a clear casting proc that doesn't interact with certain key clear casting proc mechanics. The suggested change would address that problem permanently by simply giving you a clear casting charge after you consume one, making it do the exact same thing as currently without having weird interaction with outside clear casting mechanics. For my next change, I would recommend changing Nether Tempest to, instead of it being an active, making it a passive that applies to your target whenever you cast Touch of the Magi. Currently, the only reason to cast Nether Tempest is to proc Arcane Echo, which only applies during Touch of the Magi. Outside of Touch of the Magi windows, it serves no purpose. In essence, this means that the spell acts like just another button that we need to press in our cooldown windows, which are already notoriously long. Turning this spell into a passive allows its effect to be present without bloating the action bar with more buttons. Because this spell requires Touch of the Magi in order to take effect, I would also flip the position between it and Touch of the Magi on the talent tree. My next suggested change is for Orb Barrage. First up, I want to say that this new talent is amazing, and its addition is very welcome. However, it suffers from an RNG problem that prevents Arcane from consistently doing a predictable amount of damage in AoE. Currently, if you go into a pool and proc an orb with every single barrage, you might beat every other DPS spec in the game in terms of both overall damage and funnel. However, if you fail to proc a single orb, your damage is going to be pitifully low. As such, I recommend changing this talent to where if you throw out an Arcane Barrage with 4 Arcane charges, it is guaranteed to throw out an Arcane Orb, but one that only does 30% of normal damage. This would decrease the overall damage of Orb Barrage, but grant a more consistent burst of damage from Arcane Mages in AoE. Also note that this won't turn Arcane's single target rotation into an Arcane Barrage spamfest, since in single target, this Orb Barrage proc will only generate a single Arcane charge, so your next Arcane Barrage only has a 25% chance to proc an Orb, not 100%. Adding this change introduces another problem for Arcane, which is that it makes the following talent, Reverberate, now null and void, since you would never need to use an Arcane Explosion again if you proc an Arcane Orb after every single barrage in AoE. This problem is going to be addressed with my next suggested change. My next suggested change is for Arcane Harmony, and there are several things I'd like to talk about here. The first and most obvious change is that Arcane Harmony's stacks should cap at 16 and not 20. This is because Arcane Missiles fires 8 missiles when clear casted, so requiring 20 stacks just makes no sense for this talent. The damage per stack has been adjusted from 5 to 6.25% per stack just to arrive at the same total damage gain as before, at an additional plus 100% damage. The second part of this change addresses the Reverberate talent and would allow every target hit by Arcane Explosion to generate a stack of Arcane Harmony, which would favor the use of Arcane Explosion over Arcane Missiles in AoE, while also disincentivizing Arcane Orb use since Arcane Orb would not generate Arcane Harmony stacks. This would incentivize the use of Reverberate over Charge Orb, since you would want to cast Arcane Explosion not only to generate Arcane charges, but also to generate Arcane Harmony charges in AoE. The third part of this change is to grant some kind of benefit to this talent when Arcane Barrage is used while at maximum stacks. I think there should be some kind of incentive to maximize these stacks and not clip your stacks short before using Arcane Barrage, which was the case in Season 1 of Dragonflight. In this example, I suggested increasing the critical damage dealt by Arcane Harmony, but anything could fit here. The fourth part of this change would be to make Arcane Harmony a choice node with Orb Barrage. The reason for this is twofold. Prodigious Savant, the talent right before Orb Barrage, increases the damage of Arcane Barrage, providing a natural synergy between it and Arcane Harmony by increasing Arcane Barrage damage dealt. The second reason to move this talent is that Arcane Harmony is currently stuck behind two Arcane Missile talents that have almost no interaction with it, since you do not need increased clear casting procs to generate your required Arcane Harmony stacks. This is because you only use Arcane Barrage every 45 seconds or so with this build, and during your cooldown windows, you usually get 1 or 2 clear casting procs from the rotation anyways. Arcane Harmony has a much better synergy with talent that buffs Arcane Barrage, like Prodigious Savant, rather than talents that increase clear casting Arcane Missile's proc rate. In order to replace that talent slot, I recommend creating a talent that focuses on Arcane Missiles, since the two prior talents are centered around that. I suggest adding the following talent, which would allow clear casting Arcane Missiles to fire an additional 2 missiles, acting as a 25% damage buff, while also allowing Arcane Missiles to cleave to nearby targets, similar to the Season 3 tier set, which was overall well received. I think this talent is far more fitting to that part of the tree, which clearly focuses on Arcane Missiles. The next talent change I would propose is for Rule of Threes. This is a talent that has seen almost no play for the past 2 expansions, simply due to it being undertuned. However, I think we can use this opportunity to not only make it better, but also use it to fix problems with certain builds. The current Arcane Harmony build, as well as the one from Shadowlands, is heavily reliant on critical strikes to happen on Arcane Barrage to do its damage, since so much of your damage is focused on a single big barrage. This creates a problem where if you don't crit, you will never be able to do as much damage as someone who did the exact same rotation as you, but did crit on their Arcane Barrage. The tier set from Season 1 tried to address this problem in a roundabout way, by allowing critical strikes from Arcane Blast and Arcane Explosion to increase the critical strike chance of Arcane Barrage by up to 40%. However, this was clunky mainly because the crit buff only had a duration of 12 seconds, so if you didn't use your barrage in that window and didn't get another crit with Arcane Blast, your buff would fall off. I suggest using Rule of Threes to fix that problem by allowing every third hit to be guaranteed critical strike with reduced critical damage, but preventing you from being able to crit outside of every third hit. This idea actually stems from a number of successful champion releases in League of Legends, such as Kennen and Xin Zhao, paired with Ashe's current crit passive. The reason for the decreased critical damage is that without it, this talent would provide a massive amount of damage in a single point, while removing crit scaling altogether, neither of which is good. As such, if this talent is implemented, it should have decreased baseline crit damage, while also allowing the crit stat to instead increase the critical damage of the third hit. In case you're curious, to make both the current iteration and this new Rule of Threes have identical damage and scaling, this talent would need to decrease critical damage by 110% and increase critical scaling by 330%. This means at 0 crit stat, with a baseline of 7% crit for mages given our Tome of Ronin talent, our third hit would only crit for 23% additional damage. At 30% crit, our third hit would crit for about 99% additional damage, which is about the same as a normal critical strike. At 100% crit chance, which is about 22,000 crit stat, this third hit would crit for 330% additional damage, or 4.3 times the normal damage. Regardless of what numbers are chosen, I think this talent should be considered given that Arcane Harmony desperately needs a way to guarantee critical strikes on its big Arcane Barrage. My last suggested change to Arcane is to the Mastery effect as well as Prodigious Savant, since this talent impacts Mastery scaling. Arcane's Mastery is currently the only DPS Mastery in the game with 4 different scaling variables, which makes it incredibly complicated and difficult for new players to understand when they should prioritize Mastery. I think the effect could be simplified to just increases Arcane damage by X% instead of having separate scaling for Arcane Blast and Arcane Barrage. For Prodigious Savant, I would change its effect to mirror Critical Mass and Winter's Blessing for Fire and Frost respectively, simplifying its effect to simply give Mastery and increase the Mastery received from gear and buffs. That's all the changes I have for Arcane. Now let's move on to Fire Mage. Overall, I think the Fire changes were very successful, with only a couple of nitpicks that I would add to polish out the tree. My first suggested change is to Tempered Flames, since this talent currently sees no play in PvE. I would recommend removing the 50% decreased combustion duration and instead making it increase the damage dealt by hardcast power blasts. This would provide single target synergy with the Sun King's Blessing talent, making it much more attractive in single target, since it currently sees no play whatsoever due to it being a choice node with a much better talent, and being an overall DPS loss due to decreased combustion uptime. My second suggested change is mainly aimed at Living Bomb and Convection. Currently, Living Bomb doesn't do enough damage to be utilized, including in mass AoE. This could be fixed by simply increasing the damage it does, but I think there's a better way to do this. The other problem with Living Bomb is that you have to pick it up as well as Convection in order to pick up Firefall, which is an amazing damage boost for both single target and AoE if you're using the Ignite build. This inherently means that you're wasting 2 points on Living Bomb and Convection just to get to Firefall, while knowing that you'll never press Living Bomb in AoE or in single target. I propose the following change to Living Bomb as well as to Convection to fix all of those problems. In this suggested change, Living Bomb is instead passively applied to your target after consuming a Hot Streak, either through Pyroblast or a Flame Strike. It then stores 25% of the damage dealt by your next 3 Pyroblast or Flame Strikes and explodes to deal that damage to the target as well as all others within 8 yards, giving it use in both single target and in AoE without contributing to button bloat. This passive would have a 45-second cooldown before applying again. This would have amazing synergy with the Firefall talent that Fire Mages are already working towards when picking up Living Bomb, and would also work well with Incendiary Eruptions when using the Flame Strike build, since you would simply blow up that Living Bomb with Flame Strikes as is intended with the build. For Convection, I propose to have it increase the damage stored by Living Bomb by 10% for Pyroblast and 75% for Flame Strike. The larger increase for Flame Strike is there so that Fire Mages never end up in a situation where their Living Bomb procs from Incendiary Eruptions, and they suddenly have to tab through their targets to start Pyroblasting that Living Bomb target instead of just continuing to cast Flame Strike. Regardless of the situation, this keeps in with the theme of having Living Bomb be useful in both single target and in AoE. The next suggested change is for Unleashed Inferno, which is a very cool talent that has unfortunately missed its mark. Currently, this talent has a very similar damage profile as Sun King's Blessing, namely as a result of its frequent combustions from its inbuilt cooldown reduction, only with inferior DPS. I think the intended goal for this talent was to have a mega combustion burst similar to what we saw with Fire Mages in BFA, where they would do huge amounts of damage every 2 minutes with low damage in between them. In order to reorient this talent towards that goal, I recommend increasing the damage from 50% to 100%, adding an additional 30% haste during combustion, and increasing Ignite's damage by 25%, since that is how Fire Mages did AoE damage during Season 4 of BFA. In order to balance that, I removed the cooldown reduction aspect of this talent and the cooldown reduction interaction of both Shifting Power and Kindling, meaning that combustion with this talent would be hard stuck to a 2-minute cooldown. Given the large downtime this build would have, I recommend using that opportunity to increase the value of Hyperthermia, since this talent also rarely sees any kind of play. Simply put, I suggest allowing this talent to grant the effects of Unleashed Inferno if talented. There already isn't much value in picking up Hyperthermia with the Sun King's Blessing build, since you're so often in combustion and this talent cannot proc while you're in the middle of combustion, so this wouldn't buff the current build in any way. This would, however, give Hyperthermia and Unleashed Inferno some really nice synergy as the current underdog talents. The last change I would suggest was something that I heard from the Mage community, and that would be to allow a toggle option for Flame Strike and Meteor to apply to your current target instead of having to have a mouse over macro. The main reason for this change is that you sometimes have to kick a target or decurse an affix in a dungeon, and moving your cursor to that target means you can't Flame Strike or Meteor. That's it for my fire changes, now moving on to Frost. I think Frost was probably the most successful of the 3 reworks, with very little to complain about. The only thing that was mentioned to me was that Splintering Rate is currently not being used in AoE, so I would just recommend buffing that a little bit, but otherwise that's it. That's it for me. Leave a comment down below if there's anything else you'd like to mention or disagreed with in one way or another. Best of luck.